honor for me and a privilege. It's also, I'm sure, a great excitement for all of our viewers and subscribers to get a chance to hear from you. We'd like to get, among other things, your take on a very exciting initiative that's happening both in Switzerland and somewhat a little different but similar in Sweden, and that is cash rights, possibly in Switzerland being enshrined in the near future here, we hope, in the Constitution to protect the citizens of Switzerland's right to cash. And we've talked about the perils, the threat to our privacy and our freedom of a cashless society. I think some people just have no idea what's coming our way on this freight train that seems unstoppable until some brave souls with the indomitable spirit of the human spirit rise up and say, not in my backyard, not here. We're going to hear about that. We also want to get your look back at the year 2025 and review what a remarkable record-breaking year it has been, both for gold and for silver, and also your thoughts about the current trajectory we're heading on, what the main movers are, and what your view is of the year ahead. So could we start out with this news story that just broke in the past week or so about both Sweden and Switzerland having major initiatives for citizens' rights to cash, and how that stands in stark contrast to the potential dire consequences of this steamroller. It seems to be global in nature, that's happening to countries across the world, and we've seen it all around us, towards cashless society. What that would mean to us in our lives, and what this cash rights potentially constitutional amendment in Switzerland would mean for the people.
Yeah, listen, obviously these are little rays of light in an otherwise kind of, I hate to say it, dark horizon in terms of the tokenization and the digitalization of just about everything, including currencies. And I have to say, before I laud Swiss and Swedish attempts to kind of push back, I'm not convinced it's going to stop Europe and the West in general from eventually going cashless, but it is, as you said, nice to see a little resistance here. And, you know, before we get into Sweden and in Switzerland in particular, two countries for which my colleague von Greyerz is a citizen of, so we certainly talk and think about this a lot. They're amazing countries for different reasons, and Switzerland in general has this tremendous history of direct democracy. Switzerland is many countries in one, but they share a real strong respect for the citizens' views. You need to have citizen direct involvement in major decisions in the country, which ironically in America, the home of, you know, freedom and democracy, we don't even see the same level of. And I think for folks who get a chance to come to Switzerland, it's more than just chocolate and cheese and beautiful horizons. There's a really strong ethic in Switzerland about citizen rights and citizen voting. And this, you know, pushback against going cashless is an example of that. In Switzerland, too, as many countries in one. The French side of Switzerland, Geneva, is very different than the German side in Zurich, and very different than the Italian section in Lugano, all of which are very beautiful, but very different. But again, they all share this interest in being directly involved in their citizens, and also in their citizens' decisions and in their government's decisions. You know, on the flip side, you know, Switzerland is clearly, if anyone has been there, and certainly I'm there all the time, it's very app and card dominant. Only about 25% of transactions in Switzerland are in cash, and the idea is innovation is key. And there is this thing called Crypto Valley in Switzerland. There's over 1,000 fintech and blockchain companies, and they're all leaders in integrating digital technologies and currencies. Yet on the flip side of that is this liberty movement, which has already acquired over 100,000 signatures, so they can go to the upper and lower houses in Switzerland. And they're pushing really to enshrine cash, coins and notes, as part of the Constitution, because they don't want to see the digitalization of all things, including the Swiss franc, for a lot of the reasons that you and I have talked about, or Elijah and I have talked about with each other and with other guests, that there is something very effective and very efficient and very speedy about digitalized currencies. They certainly move faster than certain SWIFT systems and other things, but we also know they're very programmable, trackable, and ultimately seizable. So as things go from bad to worse, which we'll talk about later, and I'm not saying this happens tomorrow or next week, but in an uh-oh moment, in a geopolitical uh-oh moment, in a financial uh-oh moment, having digital currencies will be a lot easier to control, take, and manipulate than cash in a Folgers can, so to speak. So coins and notes still matter to some of us, no matter what the official narrative is. There is clearly a trend in the U.S. and certainly in Europe by 2029 to be more and more digital. So this liberty movement in Switzerland, I think, is a light, is a ray of hope, and we'll see. That'll probably be decided in 2026. As you mentioned as well, Sweden is doing the same thing. Its Riksbank, its central bank, is talking about a referendum where they make it clear that essential goods like cash at grocery stores or at doctor's offices or for certain services, that cash will be allowed. I can tell you, living in France and Switzerland and in Germany and in the U.S., going back and forth to all these countries, first of all, we all see it in the U.S. in certain stadiums for sports. You can't buy a beer or a Coke or a hot dog in cash anymore. And certainly I see that in France in particular. It's harder and harder just to bring out a euro and actually use it in certain places. And this trend towards digitalization, I'm afraid, is I think that train has left the station and is coming. What happens in Sweden and Switzerland with these referendums and these upper and lower house decisions, I hope pass. I think they will. I think that shows a little bit of a pushback. I know in Sweden, it's their defense ministry that's saying, look, it's great to be prepared and innovative, but we're way too dependent and vulnerable on electronics and electronic vulnerability and cyber warfare. And what happens if there is some type of major blast in the electronic systems? Anyone who lives in Europe, and certainly I've spent a lot of time in Spain too, which is kind of our Florida here. Spain has a lot of power outages. We've had a lot in Southern Europe. I experienced them in France, less so in Switzerland. But those are little hints that what would happen if we, quote unquote, lost that electrical web that we think is permanent and immortal. So these type of concerns about just vulnerability and defense are one thing. I think the larger concern that you and I and your audience has is really more about the programmability, trackability, and seizability of these digital currencies. So again, we'll keep our fingers crossed in 2026. Sweden and Switzerland are very important countries, but they're not the whole world. Will there be a contagion effect? Will other countries jump on? We'll see. But sadly, the momentum you and I see in the States and everywhere in the world, and what I see in Europe too, is increasingly more and more talk and more direction towards cards, apps, and eventually central bank digital currency, stable coins, other types of basically Diet Coke versions of central bank digital currencies. In the U.S., stablecoin is just a central bank digital currency issued by fintech and by commercial banks, but it's the same thing. So these are rays of hope, but Dunnigan, I'm not going to promise that the world in Europe is waking up. But it's certainly nice to see an effort to remind folks that cash and coins still matter and that they should still be used for Pete's sake, at a grocery store or at a sporting event or in more essential things like a doctor's office. And I see a lot of older citizens where I live in the countryside. It's very sad. I mean, they literally don't know how to use certain cards. Even trash pickup in Europe, you need a special card for. Some people can't afford those cards or don't know how to use those cards. They still have purses with coins. They're innocent, trusting people. That's the saddest part of all. They really don't have much choice. They really do trust their systems. They assume this is innovation. They assume this is better. They're getting more and more used to it. But I feel they don't see the darker side of what digitalization and certainly e-coronas, e-dollars, e-euros mean for the next 20 years out and what the next generation is going to be facing, especially if things go wrong. And that's when the digitalization darker side will show up. But again, these are all things we've talked about in the past, and we'll see where we're going. But 2026 would be nice to see the Swiss once again do something different than the rest of the Eurozone and stand up for something that most people don't talk about enough.
Yeah, there's something interesting about human psychology, and especially that of crowds, and that is that it makes a big difference. A little difference can make a big difference. When you have someone stand up, speak the words, and take the action, and all of a sudden a spark is resonated in everyone else's heart as it goes, yeah, that's right. That's what I was feeling and thinking, but I didn't have the words, or I didn't know how to stand up, or I didn't know how to take effective action, because it can feel quite overwhelming and frankly numbing. Most of us, well, at least the adults that I talk to in our 55 plus community where my wife and I live, are having a hard enough time just remembering our passwords into the umpteen trillion different devices. Somebody's television just went out and they had to get the app on the phone and then had to link it to the account and they had to scan the QR code and then call customer support and do all this stuff. You used to be able to just turn on the darn TV. So that idea of feeling like I'm not capable anymore of fixing on my car or doing anything because it's all technical and it's all in the cloud and it's all in the algorithms and people just start withdrawing and feeling disempowered and feeling hopeless. That's not a good thing for free people. It's not a good thing for people who intend on maintaining their liberty and their freedom going forward, or let alone their privacy, the ability to transact, to be active agents in their lives. And that's separate from even being able to have savings outside the system that are just yours, your fruits of your labor that you can use later. This is something that's, from a preparedness standpoint, you've been with us over the decades. We've talked about preparedness. You got to have real food and real tools and real skills and real friends, and you got to have some reserves of these essentials of life. Any further comments?
Absolutely. I mean, again, we spend a lot of time talking about very complex, wonky headlines, and they're certainly relevant. But it's sometimes getting back to the brass tacks, is the grassroots of what we're really experiencing. And in France, where I also have where a residence is, I mean, even a simple credit card transaction to do an online purchase or at a grocery store, sometimes you have to go through 3 or 4 steps to confirm your security. It slows down your freedom of transaction in the name of efficiency, but it actually feels like more and more control. There are times I'm literally ordering things online, I just stop. It's too many steps. And those are anecdotal examples of frustrations, but they're hardly life-altering. But when things, and I do think things are only going to get worse in terms of civil liberties, in terms of economic conditions, in terms of centralization and government desperation with their backs against these debt walls, these type of inconveniences of triple notifications and codes, this X, Y, and Z, will become crippling. And the more that this is centralized and programmable and trackable, and the more that this becomes out of our control, the more we're going to feel more vulnerable. Right now, there's still quote unquote good times, or things haven't gotten desperate, although there's plenty of evidence that they are. We're not nearly in the type of frustration range that we could be in. And again, we hope we're wrong, but we're already seeing the signs of these frustrations everywhere, in the narrowing of liberties and the narrowing of free choice. Even the choice to use coins and cash in your wallet is slowly eroding. It's death by 1,000 cuts, but this is nothing new to debt broken systems. The dishonesty, the manipulation, the misnarratives, the malinformation pours through, and what we're being told is good for our efficiency and transactional authority is actually the very opposite of that. So again, let's give a round of applause to the folks of Switzerland and Sweden for at least raising the issue, but they're fighting a big tide, that's for sure.
Something you mentioned earlier on this, just one last re-hit at something you mentioned before, and that is the bewitching attraction of electronic transaction methods, or methods for all aspects of our lives, information interchange, everything, is efficiency and low cost and speed. Those are typically convenience, speed, and low. But it's only convenient when it works. And the moment, and this assumes you have both an operable environment from a technological standpoint, and also a benign environment from a control and authoritarian standpoint. When that switches over into outages, we've had some rather glorious outages, whether through major cyber outages. We had Amazon Web Services down for a day plus, and it shut down airlines all over the United States and so on. And even our local restaurant, they couldn't even serve. Nobody in town could serve anything smoked because the electronic safety sensors on the vent hoods were interlocked with the whatever, and where they can't take your payment at a cafe or wherever because the systems are down. Or when you get denied, just as happens in China with the social credit scores, or as happened in Australia when you violated the curfew or whatever restrictions that were placed on you during the COVID lockdowns, et cetera, cash persists. It allows you to remain operable and free and have your privacy in those situations as well.
Exactly, Donegan. Exactly. And you see the direction this is going. This is about control. And throughout history, without exception, going all the way back to ancient Rome to today, if you look at the rise and fall of hegemonic empires and their power and their currencies and their debasement and their policies, the last chapters of a fourth turning in each of these examples, again, from the Dutch to the Portuguese to the Spanish to the British empires to the U.S., it always ends up in some form of increased centralization and control, less civil liberties, less personal choice, and not having the ability to have cash in your pocket is one clear example of how that's eroding. And unfortunately, this is nothing new. The more things change, the more they stay the same. We're in the cycle now, not at the end of the world, but a rapidly changing world, and it's not going to be smooth, and it usually leads to more desperation, more dishonesty, more manipulation. And these are things, again, that repeat throughout history, and we're living in right now. We're literally living in it as we speak, which sometimes is the hardest to see.
Well, kudos to Sweden and Switzerland for being bright lights in otherwise dark times. Talk to us also about your look back at the year 2025, as particularly focusing perhaps on geopolitics, global finance, but the gold and silver markets perhaps in particular. Look back, and then we'll turn to the 2026 look ahead.
Yeah, I just posted today my on the Von Greyerz website at vongreyerz.gold or Gold Switzerland. I just published my look ahead, look behind, and I said, there's been a lot of change this year, and we certainly have to look at 2025 with the specific headlines. But before we wring our hands, the irony is the bigger picture, nothing's really changed. Again, the more things change, the more they say the same. The headlines coming into 2025 about making America great, these are certainly laudable things with a new president, a new White House administration coming into this year. We had a lot of hope and a lot of frustration depending on your politics. I'm not here to give a political opinion. I've always said it really doesn't matter what party or what person's in the White House at these current debt levels. We're past the Rubicon of an easy solution. But we came in with a lot of hope that we would cut spending through things like USAID and DOGE, that we'd have the External Revenue Service, through tariffs to bring in more revenue, which I've said is like kind of ironic. I don't think we're going to win the hearts and the minds of the world through tariffs. That's a debatable issue. But the key thing I saw in 2025, all of these plans, all of these hopes have not cut our spending or our deficit levels or our debt levels at all. Quite the opposite. And what the real signal for me, at least in 2025, was Liberation Day. It wasn't very liberating. We all know what it did to the markets, but Liberation Day was supposed to be a turning point with these tariffs. And it's not about the politics of the tariffs or the art of the deal or whether you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump. I'm not going to get into that rabbit hole. It's what the real signal was on Liberation Day wasn't the fact that he had to pivot in a couple of days as part of the art of the deal. The real signal in April of 2025, very boring but very critical to understand, was that the bond markets went south. There were crickets at the Treasury auction. No one was buying U.S. Treasuries, and that forced the taco move they call it. Trump always chickens out. I don't think it's that. It's just the bond market wouldn't let us prosecute a trade war or a tariff war. Whether you like that or not, we couldn't afford it. The markets tanked. Immediately, we had to pull back on our strong chest-puffing language. Again, it's neither partisan, it's not left or right. We couldn't afford it because the bond market wouldn't allow us to do it. And so I think what that signals is that the bond market wouldn't allow Trump to prosecute a trade war because rates were going up and bond prices were going down and no one was buying U.S. Treasuries. It's the same thing that happened to Powell when he tried to do higher for longer to beat transitory inflation, which we all know isn't transitory. But the debt, when he raised rates, the debt was too high. It forced him by 2024 to start reducing rates. Again, the debt in America is what's stopping America, whether you believe the policies are good or bad, from really executing policies, because the American dollar, the American IOU, the U.S. 10-year, the U.S. Treasury, and the American system simply isn't trusted as much in 2025 as it was 5 or 6 years prior for all kinds of reasons. And the symptoms of that in 2025, these desperate moves, these emergency acts we kept seeing for the tariffs, the Genius Act, to DOGE and USAID, to talking about gold revaluation, to even possibly a gold-backed treasury. These are all symptoms of a system that's cracking, that's breaking down, and is looking for desperate answers. Laudable to try them, laudable to encourage, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., laudable to try and get tariffs to pay for that, laudable to try and cut spending at USAID, laudable to try and do this DOGE initiative, but they're really guppy solutions to a whale of a problem. The problem is it's not even Trump's fault, it's not even Biden's fault or Obama's fault. It goes farther back. Every administration goes further and further into debt, and every administration knows that it can mouse click trillions of dollars to pay for that debt. that debases the currency. That's why the man on the street, well, top 10% or bottom 10%, feels this invisible tax of the debasement of their purchasing power. And those are the headlines of 2025, but those have been the headlines for years. It's the slow death of the currency because of a decision made at the time of my birth 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, in 1971, when the U.S. went off its gold backing, which was promised by our Constitution in the very first article. We reneged not only on ourselves, we reneged on the world that relied on that post-Bretton Woods promise that the world reserve currency would be dollar-backed. We reneged on that in 1971. And then we enjoyed the temporary prosperity of being able to spend with impunity in the U.S. as the home of the world reserve currency. We were able to spend with impunity because no matter what we did, someone was going to buy our U.S. treasuries, and if we couldn't afford it, the Fed would print money to give it to us. And those were the good times. But that was when U.S. debt was $250 billion, and the debt-to-GDP ratio was 38%. You fast forward to 2025, the year in review, and the debt-to-GDP ratio isn't 38%, it's 125%. And the debt isn't $250 billion, it's $38 trillion. So we're not the same America we were in 1971, and the world knows this now. Because in 1971, we reneged on the world reserve currency being redeemable in gold. They had to eat that sandwich because we're the world reserve currency. And not only did we do that, by 1973, we created a petrodollar. So even though our dollar was being debased, the whole world had to buy oil in the petrodollar. That was a brilliant move. And in 1974, we created the COMEX because the only real antagonist to the US dollar was gold and silver. So we put the COMEX futures on the COMEX market. We did absolutely undeniable open price fixing, legalized price fixing on gold and silver. And we got the petrodollar. And then we inflated our debased dollar to the rest of the world because of the home world reserve currency. That worked. That was our currency, your problem, as John Connolly said in the 70s. That's the exorbitant privilege of being the world reserve currency holder. And that worked for decades. What we're seeing by 2025, and frankly by 2022, is that the world is no longer wanting to be, again, the dog wagged by the tail of the US dollar and US policy. That exorbitant privilege, that our currency, our problem, your problem attitude, that arrogance that worked for decades, is slowly falling apart. Again, the evidence of that through de-dollarization, through the gold of central banks now hold more gold than U.S. treasuries, the movement away from the dollar. Again, we could spend hours on each of those themes, but the big picture is very simple. The joy we had, the temporary prosperity we enjoyed from 1971 at the expense of just about everybody else is now coming full circle back to a karmic reality. The world simply doesn't trust, believe in, or bow to the US dollar in the way it had to do 50 years ago because we went too far out on that branch of debt, too far on that branch of arrogance. It is now our currency, our problem, because no one wants our treasuries at auction. They want a higher premium for our IOUs because we're $38 trillion in debt. And because we weaponized that dollar and that currency in 2022. That does not make me anti-American. I thought that policy in 2022 was a terrible mistake. Regardless of what you think of Putin or Zelensky, it's irrelevant. When you weaponize the world reserve currency, you're going to debase its trust. And trust, as John Rubino has said, is falling across the horizon, not just in politics or the dollar, not just in the US, but in Europe and elsewhere. Trust in these policymakers, these central bankers, these central planners, their dishonesty, their manipulation, certainly has deteriorated extravagantly since COVID. But the world, in its review of the US dollar since 1971, we're finally, after 54 years, reaping the reckoning of our own arrogance, our own entitlement, our own idea that our currency, your problem, would be immortal. Now it's our currency, our problem, and the world is moving away from that currency. Not overnight, not the end of the world reserve currency, not the end of the dollar, but our systems are dishonest. And the invisible tax of inflation, which is an open lie, the CPI scale, the invisible tax that citizens suffer every day, in addition to all the dishonesty, all the manipulation, all the malinformation, their currency is a melting ice cube, very slowly and then all at once. And that's why gold and silver are ripping in 2024, 2025, and will continue to go up into 2026. Not because gold is like a NVIDIA trade or a tech trade or in some type of strange new bull market. It is part of a rapidly changing credit system, the end of a credit cycle. Gold and silver are rising simply because paper money in general, and the world reserve currency in particular, aren't what they used to be. They're so debased. We're in a bull market in these precious metals because they're real money. We're in a bear market in paper currencies because they're bad money. And they've gotten worse over the last 54 years. That does not mean gold and silver only go straight up and to the right and that you don't have retracements or pullbacks. That is not what I'm saying. But Egon has been saying this for 25, 30 years. This is nothing new in 2025 or 2026. It began in earnest in 1971. So when I look back or look forward, we can look at the specific headlines of the year, key moments like April, or key legislation like the Genius Act, or key events like de-dollarization or the BIS making gold a tier 1 asset, or what's happening on the COMEX markets. These were all headlines in 2025, but they're just symptoms of a problem that began 54 years ago when we welched on the Constitution, we welched on the rest of the world when we took the dollar, the world reserve currency, off of gold backing. It's not a gold bug case, it's history 101. We're just debasing the currency, lying about inflation, and the dollar you measure your wealth, your portfolio, your savings account, your checking account, even your precious metals, is a melting ice cube.
You mentioned one of the immediate clear and present signs of this is floundering U.S. bond auctions since late first quarter of 2025 and continuing. Can you talk to us about the further look ahead into 2026 of what the consequences, if history be a guide, of floundering bond auctions is likely to be?
Yeah, and I want to respect how boring the bond market is for listeners. I get it. And I don't need to get wonky on bonds, and no one wants to hear it. But bonds are the IOUs of our sovereign nation. It's how we've survived. Since we outsourced the American dream to China and manufactured in China around 2001 during the World Trade Organization fanfare, where Clinton was saying, it's great, they're going to buy all our blue jeans and widgets. What he left out is, no, they're not going to buy it. They're going to manufacture it for us and then send it back to us. So when we outsourced the American dream in 2001, that was a major mistake. We don't manufacture anymore. We're not the world's greatest manufacturer as we were in 1944 when we were the world reserve currency and a gold-backed dollar. We were the world's greatest manufacturers then. Now we're the world's greatest offshore. We're not the world's greatest creditor. We're the world's greatest debtor. So there's been a major change from the flags of Iwo Jima and Clark Gable and the great American narrative, whether we like it or not. And so if we're not manufacturing, if we're not producing, then we have to have something to sustain our system. And sadly, in the last 25 years, the major tailwind for American growth isn't productivity. And the major tailwind is really debt. So we have to issue more and more debt. But as long as there are buyers of that debt, that worked. That was the extravagant privilege. That was our currency, your problem in the 70s. But if we've noticed, certainly in 2025, Japan and China, the perennial buyers of U.S. treasuries, just aren't there anymore. Japan's had to dump U.S. treasuries to support its yen. China, which used to have 40% of its FX reserves in U.S. treasuries, as of 2025, has less than 1% in U.S. treasuries. So there is less natural demand for Uncle Sam's IOUs, our bond. That is a bond crisis. If no one is buying our bonds, the bond prices go down. And again, this is why central banks now hold more gold than they do U.S. bonds. I'm not making these facts up. They're symptoms of a world that's turning away from the IOU of Uncle Sam because he's so much in debt, because the country's so much in debt. So when there's less bond purchasing from China or Japan or from central banks who now prefer gold, openly, I'm not just saying this as a gold executive, they prefer gold as a tier 1 strategic reserve asset over Uncle Sam's sacred 10-year U.S. Treasury, that means bond prices go down. If bond prices go down, the yields go up. And yields are the real measure of interest rate expense. And there's nothing that terrifies any sovereign nation, and in the U.S. in particular, more than rising yields. Because if yields go up on U.S. Treasuries, that means the cost of their debt, their interest expense on their debt, which is already over $1 trillion, gets even more painful. So it's absolutely essential to keep those yields down. If China, Japan, and central banks aren't buying treasuries in 2025 or 2026 like they did in 2015 or 2012, that means somebody else to buy those bonds. I know it's boring, but that somebody is the central bank. It's the Fed. And what do they buy it with? Money, literally mouse clicked at the Eccles building out of thin air. When they expand money in the balance sheet at the Fed, as they're going to do, and as they've already started in December, That just debases the currency even more. It shows less and less respect for the dollar because, let's be honest, the only one buying our treasuries is going to be our Fed, and the only way the Fed can pay for that isn't tax receipts and GDP. It's a mouse clicker. That sounds so absurd and so ridiculous, but that's, in a simple way, we're drinking our own rotten Kool-Aid with a money printer. We have to buy our own debt, and we have to do it by creating money out of thin air. That's an inherently inflationary policy. That doesn't mean we won't have deflationary forces like a recession, which I think we've been in since 2022, or, gosh forbid, a market mean reversion. But I think the market's almost too big to fail. So I think the Fed will print more money, probably issue yield curve controls. The Fed's balance sheet will increase by at least $500 billion this year. The dollar should get weaker. There's a debate about that, and there's good debate to have about it. It's a longer conversation. But gold will always be a tailwind for precious metals because it is simply a better store of value than this melting ice cube printed dollars to sustain our bond market. And that's why I still see a very strong year ahead for gold. That doesn't mean there won't be pullbacks. That doesn't mean there won't be manipulation of silver on the exchanges. And we've seen samples of that already as we end the year. Of course, there's going to be manipulation. Of course, gold and silver still terrify countries like the US. But the evidence of the preference for gold isn't coming from an executive who sells gold and stores it in a hole in the ground in Switzerland. It's coming from the whole world. Jeffrey Gundlach's pushing 25% gold. Morgan Stanley is pushing 20% gold in its allocations. Central banks have been stacking over 1,000 tons a year since we weaponized the dollar in 2022. In other words, it's not just the gold camp anymore that sees this. And there's a reason why central banks hold more gold than U.S. bonds or U.S. treasuries. So it's not just the gold executives or the gold bugs, which we've been for decades, and I think we've been right for decades, that are admitting this. I think it's very important for retail investors who want to see gold as a store of value, as a better strategic reserve asset for their own savings than a dollar that's melting and being inflated away, that they realize that they shouldn't be looking at gold and silver as a trade to time or worry about peak gold or peak silver. I will never make a price target. I never have and I never will. I've always said consistently, like Egon has for decades, that gold and silver will continue to rise in a meaningful direction north because paper money will continue to be debased to pay for the debt sins of our mental midget monetary planners, whatever country you live in. And so that's why the case for gold in 2025 is no different than it was, or 2026 will be no different than it was in 2025 or 2024. It's outperformed the markets for the last 25 years. That's just starting to be recognized now. It's not I told you so. This is common sense. It isn't gold executive pushing a metal. What worries me is at some point, because gold has a very finite supply and an infinite duration, which is the exact opposite of U.S. Treasury, which has an infinite supply and a finite duration, the simple fact is gold's going to become more and more expensive for average investors to afford at any meaningful level. And that's what bothers me. And that's why if you're going to own gold for more than a trade or more than an exit and entry point, if you're going to think of it as a better store of value for your family and for a legacy investment, looking at the price and comparing it to 2024 or projecting to 2026 is not nearly as important as looking at why you need to have gold.
You just mentioned is it seems complicated. Yes, there are a lot of very complex parts to this big system. However, I think one of the things that's the most baffling is because in our gut, in our hearts, in our fiber, in our core, in our human nature, we expect money to be true. And so everything we think about is assuming money is true. And whereas we're being told that lie, and we're not being told out loud, the important part is that no, money is a lie. Money is shrinking, money is withering, money is fading. And therefore, everything seems wrong, everything seems difficult, everything seems upside down, and nothing seems to make sense because we're thinking about it wrongly out of our own innocence, our own good-natured innocence and naivety, assuming that we live in a benign society. We're not being conned by our own elected leaders. So
That's the saddest part of all, because I think I've always said the government isn't your friend. That sounds very anti-patriotic, very cynical, very gold buggy, sensational. I get that. I'm a patriot. You're a patriot. We all love our country. I think there are good politicians. There are good people in D.C. I just think they're a minority. It goes to our original point, something Egon knew decades ago, something that's harder to quantify, harder to articulate, is trust. And how do you measure the decline in trust? And how do you if you see that problem with the lie of the currency, then it's easier to see the solution. But you don't see that problem if you trust. And people who trust aren't stupid. They're not naive. They're usually very good people. They would never openly lie about a currency the way our governments do, or manipulate data, whether it's the BLS on inflation or constantly downgraded labor reports. They would not do that in their family, in their business, or with their friends. And because they're good, decent people who don't have PhDs or congressional budgets, they just assume the experts are to be trusted, because many times they could be. But the island of misfit toys that comprises our Congress and Senate today isn't, to me, our best and brightest. We've come a long way from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, or Thomas Paine, or Alexander Hamilton, or Eisenhower or Truman, who believed in balanced budgets. We're a long way from those type of figures, whether you like them or not. We don't have the type of leadership we did, but that trust in that system, and therefore that money, is sad, because you are being manipulated and discredited and lied to. And that's a strong statement. But if you look at the math and look at the history, especially since Nixon in 71, the evidence is fairly compelling. But I don't think people who don't want to hear that are bad people. They're usually very good people. That's the saddest of all. I know in Spain there are signs on the highway, don't pull over to help people with a flat tire, because many times you're being robbed when you stop to help someone with a flat tire. In other words, these thieves are taking advantage of your goodness to rob you. I'm not saying that's every politician and every government, but when you lie about inflation and you lie about sound money and you go off a gold-backed standard and you say that that's not going to be inflationary and that your dollar will be just as worth as much tomorrow as it was today, as Nixon promised, that was as much of a lie as someone robbing you on the highway in Spain. In other words, they're taking advantage of your trust to pull the wool over your eyes. And that's been going on for 5 decades now. And we're just seeing the culmination of that now. That is, again, why gold is at record highs, why it's being stacked by central banks at record levels, and why even commercial banks recommend it more than U.S. Treasuries. The evidence is overwhelming. Don't feel like you're stupid or you missed out just because you don't have gold yet. You can still get some, and you can still get some silver. Just be careful with it. And don't just do that because I, as a gold executive in Switzerland, or Egon in Switzerland, or anyone else selling this, those of us that have been in this business for decades actually believe with high conviction that we're doing you a favor to recommend an allocation to gold. Whether you're our client or not is irrelevant. If you can afford some and you could hold it for a long time, it will hold its value better than that paper dollar in your wallet, which is just a Federal Reserve note, a piece of credit, an IOU backed by nothing. It's very sad. I understand the trust in the government. Left or right, I understand it. I still believe in our country. I still believe in a good government someday. But no government right now can solve $38 trillion in debt and counting. We are past the Rubicon of an easy solution. A good leader would tell the truth about that. We wouldn't go to war. We wouldn't go into false promises. We'd, like a good family and a good father or a good mother, would sit down with the kids, or like a good board of governors, a good corporation board. We'd talk about our balance sheet more honestly with each other, and we go through it together. We can't go through that together if we don't talk honestly about the problem. And no politician can do that and stay elected. That's one of the major problems of our country.
Wow, I wish I could put that. We're going to have to focus on that last speech of yours, because I feel like it crystallizes some very, very important points that will persist and are important for people to